Thank you all again for participating in today's webinar and getting those burning questions about how to unpack a co-man relationship answered from these wonderful experts. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first I'd like to introduce Veronica Lehman, who has served on the Naturally New York board and is a partner at JPG Resources, which is a great partner to us all. So I will let Veronica take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Adrienne. It's great that we've got such a good turnout today. My background, besides JPG, I'm a senior advisor for Magnolia Star Baking Supply Company, and I'm the founder of Pure Organic, which is an organic fruit strip company sold in Costco and other conventional retailers. I've definitely dealt with my share of co-man, so I know this is a really important topic, and I'm excited to moderate today. We've got three very experienced guests that are kind of coming at it from different angles, Jeremy, Mary, and Vince. I'm going to hand it over to you guys to do just short intros, and then we'll get started. Mary, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Drew. I'm with Kerry Ingredients, and I'm the Food Safety and Quality Director for Third Party Manufacturing's North America. I've been in the business for many, many years, have always had a passion for quality and food safety, and third-party manufacturing is very important to all of us. So excited to be here.
Great, thank you. Welcome, Mary. Jeremy.
Sure, thanks, Veronica. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Halpern. I'm a partner and the co-chair of the food and beverage practice at a law firm in Boston called Nutter, McLennan and Fish. We go by Nutter. We don't make peanut butter, no matter what people say. The firm is kind of an Uber boutique. We're about 160 lawyers spread through Massachusetts, New York, California, and DC area. And the food and beverage group works with clients from every stage, early stage idea and a person up through billion-dollar food companies. But the bread and butter of the practice is working with brands like most of you on this call that are in the startup and growth phase, that are angel, venture, or private equity backed. And we work with them for pretty much everything they need around financing, corporate work, intellectual property. And we do a lot of commercial work around co-packing, distribution, sales and marketing, endorsement deals, all of those kinds of things. And if successful, often merger and acquisition transactions at the far end. So if you have questions related to co-packing or other kinds of things and you want to get a hold of me, my info will be in the packet at the end of the session, and please feel free to reach out. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Vince.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vince Sang. I'm the CEO and co-founder of PartnerSlate. PartnerSlate is a marketplace that helps CPG brands find and work with contract manufacturers and other suppliers. We have about 6,000 co-mans on the platform. And in addition to PartnerSlate, I'm an active investor in a number of food technology and food brands. And I'm a partner in an award-winning popsicle shop here in Philadelphia, where I'm based.
Great. Thanks, everyone. All right, well, let's kick it off. Vince, I'm going to direct the first question to you. As a CEO of PartnerSlate, where lots of big and small companies alike come to get help with finding the right co-manufacturer, I know that often the very first line of thought for these companies is, should I dive in and try to make this myself, or should I work with a co-man? And I guess I'd love your thoughts on whether, basically what are the important things to consider when you're thinking about making it yourself versus a co-man, and what advice can you give people that are in that situation?
Thanks, Veronica. I think there is a lot of sort of angst about finding that perfect contract manufacturer when you first have the idea for your brand and maybe you've had your first successes. I think the answer to your question really depends on what product it is that you have, what kind of volumes you're looking to manufacture, and how complex is the product. In some cases, you won't be able to do things out of a home kitchen if there is a complex process, like you're trying to make a plant-based bacon or something that really requires a lab and commercial equipment. But for the vast majority of you entrepreneurs on the call, you're likely to have something that is something that you can make in your home kitchen. Maybe you've already done that, and maybe you've already done that in a commercial kitchen. I think the most important factor is going to be to realize that once you go to a contract manufacturer, it is a commercial process. And as such, they typically have minimum order quantities that will sort of dictate both whether or not they'll even be willing to speak with you, and then what kind of prices you can get from a contract manufacturer. In many cases, most brands, when they speak to their first contract manufacturer, will actually be very surprised at how high the cost is at their minimum volume. And your first thought may be, well, I can do this for less at a commercial kitchen, doing it myself or hiring somebody to run it at a commercial kitchen. And that's actually the right answer for most of you, which is that a commercial kitchen should be able to support you until you are doing the kinds of volumes where you feel like that process is just breaking down. Because all of the processes and overhead that is involved with working with in a commercial setting at a contract manufacturer are going to dictate sort of like bottom line that the co-manufacturers will have to do their engagement. So we typically recommend most brands, depending on the kind of product that they're working with, to have at least 50 to 100,000 in sort of product sales before you even think about approaching a contract manufacturer. And oftentimes it won't make a huge amount of sense from a cost standpoint until you're sort of in the $250,000, $300,000 worth of sales a year range. And then it starts to make sense from a financial standpoint. So for those that are still working in their home kitchens and they're looking at, well, how do I get to that point? The good news is that there's a lot of commercial kitchens around locally in both the New England area and the New York area. There's a wonderful resource called The Kitchen Door. Just you can Google it or go to thekitchendoor.com, which will help you locate your nearest commercial kitchens, and there you can get set up and get started.
Super helpful. Mary or Jeremy, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, just really tagging on, Vince is right on point. I would say from a quality and food safety standpoint, right? You really need to right size your quality assurance to the needs of your customer base. So depending on, as Vince nicely outlined, the size of the business, of course, there's always the base minimum that you must meet FDA and you must meet FSMA regulations and local health, depending on how small the business is. And then from there, really kind of breaking it apart into pieces as you ladder up the expectations, the bigger the size of the prize, of course, many times the level up to heightened quality and food safety, regulatory, sustainability and ethics. And then you definitely kind of the umbrella over that, which I think is a nice layup for Jeremy, would be relational, like reputation management. So it's, as Vince kind of pointed out, there are many details, but baseline, always make sure that you're following FDA and FSMA guidelines. And there are so many sources that you can work with. In fact, I would recommend sitting down with a third-party consult, some really great food safety professionals out there. You've got companies like Eurofins, Mary U, NSF, DMV. And they're all so willing to work with you and right size your programs appropriately.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that can be intimidating if you're a founder. And I think a very important consideration too is, where do you want to be in the business? Do you want to be if you're a founder, do you want to be out front managing relationships and sales, or do you want to be managing operations in the back? And I think if you're considering doing your own manufacturing, you're going to be spending a lot of time managing that process. So getting the experts involved is important. Jeremy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, a few things. The first is that this process is scary and it's informationally asymmetric. And by that, I mean, you, the brand, have probably never done this before. And the co-packer, this is all that they do. And they use that information asymmetry to their advantage throughout this entirety of the process. So the first thing is, there's a world of difference between a co-man that says we can do a thing, because if you call a co-man and say, can you do this? Their answer to all those questions is yes. And that does not mean that they do it well. It doesn't mean that they do it safely or consistently or with history. And so Mary started the conversation around reputation, but finding a consultant or even another entrepreneur who has worked with that co-man and to find out how has it gone is absolutely critically important. Number two, the only thing I know about co-mans is I've never had a client, and I had literally 1,000 clients in the food space. Never had a client who didn't eventually have some kind of issue with a co-man. And so the issue is not how do they behave when everything is perfect. The issue is how do they behave when something doesn't go perfect, and getting some information about what happens if you're late with an ingredient delivery? What happens if there's a power outage? What happens if there's a line shift problem? Like, how do they communicate? How do they behave? How much of the risk and the pain do they push onto you, the brand? Critical issues. Number three, Mary started the conversation, and some of these acronyms are unfamiliar to people, but most co-mans either do or do not comply with one of the two big certification agencies. And so often the very first question you need to ask is, aside from can they make this thing, is, are you SQF or BRC certified? And the reason that's so important is for a lot of you in your distribution deals or your retailer deals, you have to represent that you're manufacturing in accordance with those standards. And so if you want to be selling in Whole Foods, if you want to be selling to certain other retailers, that's just a red light, green light issue. And so there's no point qualifying a co-man who can't meet that standard. And then similarly, any of the certifications you need for your product, are they kosher certified? Are they organic certified? Are they non-GMO certified? What do they have, and how does that stack up with what you need for your product? And then there's lots of other economic stuff we're going to talk about through the course of this program. But those are kind of baseline issues, which is reputation, execution, and then do they meet just your check the box needs?
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. That's great information. There's a lot of founders who are probably in this call going, I can't even get co-mans to call me back, let alone like start having a checklist of what they have to be for me. So, where do they go to even find a list of co-mans? How do you get co-mans to respond? How do you approach a co-man and get them interested in doing the dance with you? Vince, since you're with PartnerSlate, that's what you guys do, why don't you start us off on this one as well?
Yeah, so there are a lot of free public resources. There are registries and databases online that you can access for free, like the Specialty Food Co-Packers Association. There are a number of trade organizations like the Contract Packaging Association that has some co-packers on their website. And then there are trade shows, the biggest of which is the PLMA trade show, Private Label Manufacturers Association, which happens in 2 weeks in Chicago. And they don't have an online database, but they do have this, I don't know if you can see it right here. They have a giant book with all of their co-manufacturers. But they only give this out as a physical copy. So you would have to go to the PLMA show in Chicago to get a copy of that. And then just to toot our own horn a little bit, this is really the reason why PartnerSlate was formed, because there is a lack of transparency. And as Veronica alluded to earlier, oftentimes when you reach out to many of these co-packers, you won't even get a response from them, either because they're too busy, or often is the case, they get so many inquiries through their website and most of them are not suitable for their combination of size and their specific capabilities, that they just end up not responding to any of those emails or phone calls that are inbound. And so what PartnerSlate does is you post a project to the marketplace, and then the interested manufacturers will reply to you and connect directly with you, so that you have guaranteed connections to speak to you. I do want to address the question that Kashana asked in chat. Asked, what role does PartnerSlate play? There are definitely some contract manufacturers out there that have had bad reputations for various reasons, and this is not just small contract manufacturers. You've probably seen the news about a contract manufacturer for Boar's Head recently that had a gross food safety issue with the pathogens that were growing there. And the reality is that it is because the contract manufacturer relationship is very difficult. This is not something like a restaurant that you can rate on Yelp. A contract manufacturer that may be a great partner for decades with one company may be a terrible partner for somebody else, because it is not within their core wheelhouse of capabilities, or they're too small. And so the brand that tried to work with them didn't get any attention and felt like the service was rude. So it really depends on finding the right manufacturer, and it's not always a case of a poor review for a manufacturer. So I'll pause there and let others chime in as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy or Mary, if you've got something to add to that.
Sure. I think that one of the question was, how do you get them to respond to you? And it's worth taking a second to think about who are these companies, and what is their business, and how and why do they operate, right? So if you picture a typical co-manufacturer, and they really do vary based on size, but it's some business that owns a bunch of physical infrastructure equipment, right? So they bought very, very expensive equipment that's typically being financed by a bank. So they have the equivalent of, a car payment on these big equipments. And then they have often permanent staff who do the business development and who do the marketing and who run the operation. And then they have line staff, and the line staff historically was more stable, but particularly post-COVID is often folks who are, maybe they've got 6 months of experience, maybe they have the 2 weeks of experience, maybe they have 10 years of experience. It's one of those things to try and qualify who are these people. And their business model is all about amortization. They can run that line X number of shifts per number of days of week. And so you can ask a co-man, are you a 2-5? Are you a 2-6? Are you a 1-5? Right? It's number of shifts per day, number of days a week. And they're interested in a brand that they can both support now and that's going to grow to fill as much of their capacity as they can without presenting them with unreasonable risk. So they're interested in folks who are capitalized, where they're not being asked to front the ingredient costs. They're looking for people who have their R&D chops together, so they're not struggling to produce a product, right? People already know the product, and you're not going to be able to do all these things. You're not going to be able to show up as a small brand with this stuff, but that's what they like, because they want to just turn the crank. They want to turn the crank. They want to have no downtime, and they want to get paid on time, right? That's their business model. So it's useful to know that as you go into a conversation with them about that's how their brains are thinking. And if you call them and say, well, I might do one order of 40 grand, and then I don't know, we'll see. Of course they don't call you back, right? Because that's a lot of work to get spun up and do a line trial and do all of the learning they have to do that one run, only to then have you not order any more product. So anyway, a little bit of backstory I think is helpful. And Mary, I'm sure you see this all the time.
Yeah, I think, Vince and Jeremy are spot on, right? I think considering how you can help that third-party manufacturer, I would also say, in the 3 decades that I've been in this business across various categories, from food service to retail, B2B, B2C, in many cases, right, the third-party manufacturers are linked in heavily to what they call food service, right? Servicing, organizations like a McDonald's, like a, Wendy's, et cetera. So being able to help them heighten their volumes and build their efficiencies, because in many cases, those are very low margin businesses, will entice them to be interested in what you have. So.
Yeah, we always tell people to, you know, and what we did when looking for manufacturers, my intro email to a co-man was, you know, this is what we're making. We're currently doing X. We're forecasted to do this. You know, when you start putting concrete, tangible numbers in there, and dollar sales, to Vince's point, you know, they are much more likely to call you back. I mean, it's a little bit of a pitch, just like you would a retailer. This is the company, this is the brand, we're going places, we're making this much right now, we've grown this much. Like, to me, that's the way you get them to notice you. And then you get a little more power, you know, because you've got 3 or 4 that have responded to you. So now you can start being choosy a little bit. And I think that that's the balance, right? Like, when you're small, but you've got a great brand, you believe in your product, you know, how do you get these guys to kind of see your vision too? And that's a big part of it. Okay, so let's say that you've gotten some commands to respond. Jeremy, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but you know, now maybe you've got like 2 or 3 options. How do you start narrowing that down? And what do you need to prioritize? You know, things that you've got things like, obviously, capabilities, locations, you know, future products, MOQs, but from your perspective, like, how do brands prioritize? What do they need to prioritize when they're looking to kind of narrow down and make that final co-man selection?
Yep. Unfortunately, it's too many things, and that means that your priorities end up always conflicting, right? It's a web and a matrix, and so there's 15 or 20 things you're trying to tackle, and they often pull against each other. And so I'll try and outline a few of them. But weirdly, I'll start with the one where my colleagues at, you know, JPG and other consultants usually hate me, which is, for me and my clients, I will tell you that price is not the most important thing.
I agree.
With a little bit of, you know, caveat, which is that, you know, if it's a difference within 10%, you know, 10 points of margin for you, that's certainly important, but those are not going to be the things that make or break your company over the next 12 to 24 months. And so let's talk about the things that do make or break your company. The matrix of a relationship is always defined mostly by like 2, 3 critical things. Number one, are you exclusive with them, or do you have a minimum annual volume with them? If you do, you are locked into this co-man, which means that anything that goes wrong, you have a problem. You still have a partner you can't walk away from. And so if they say, well, you're going to do $3 million with us next year, or X number of units, however it's expressed, or we are the only party you are going to work with, that is a real commitment, and it binds the company in a very meaningful way. Number 2 is the pricing fixed or variable? Meaning, if you're going to lock in with them, are they giving you an all-in total price, or are they giving you basically a price that says, but you know, every quarter we can adjust the price, and oh yeah, by the way, the ingredients are going to be actuals, so we don't know what that price is. So you get really excited because you say, oh, it's going to be $7 a case, and then it turns out that it's never $7 a case in the history of that relationship, right? It's a myth. And so don't, you know, really understand what's happening there. Number 3 is it an all-in relationship where they are doing everything for you, including ingredient ordering, or are you doing a lot of the ingredient ordering? And the reason from my perspective that matters so much is if they're responsible for everything, then you have what I refer to as a full quality wrapper, meaning it doesn't matter what went wrong, it's a their problem. And there's 4 parties involved. There's you, your insurance, them, their insurance. So if you have an issue and they did it start to finish, you call them and say, your problem, fix it. And if you've got the right contract language, it's their problem and they've got to fix it, or their insurance has to fix it. Once you take on any portion of the responsibility for doing stuff, the first thing that comes out of that co-man's mouth when you have a problem is, oh, it was the ingredients. I don't care what the problem was. That's the very first thing you're going to hear back is, it was something in your ingredients. And then you have a fight about who's responsible for this thing. And so Well, from a pricing and control perspective, it's really attractive to be able to control the ingredient sourcing, because you're going to get a better price maybe than they're going to get because you're more attuned to it. Maybe not. They're also volume buying commodities, right? They're going to get a better price on sugar than you are because they're buying more of it at a go.
Yep.
But that's attractive. But at the same time, you're giving up this ability to say, okay, I know where the locus of responsibility is, and this is on them. So that matrix of, is there exclusivity? Is it a long-term deal? Is the pricing fixed or is it variable? And who's ultimately responsible for quality? Those are like the linchpin issues. And then everything flows out of that. The one other thing I'd offer is that if they're sourcing ingredients, the single best thing that can happen to an early stage brand is that the co-man will source the ingredients, float the inventory cost of those ingredients, and still give you like net 30 or net 60 terms. Because now you're in a position where you can finance your inventory in a positive cash cycle, meaning you don't have to raise equity or debt to go buy the ingredients to give to the co-man and then wait 120 days to get paid on them. That is a huge growth driver if you can get that done. So just put that out there.
And you can get a credit card and have another 30 days if you put it on a credit card. Just a founder trick right there. I used to put my $30,000 runs on a credit card and give myself another 30 days to pay it. I think that's really good advice. The one thing I would add is to make sure you ask the question around intellectual property, because you really want to understand formula ownership. Often there's a few tweaks that they have to make for it to run right on their equipment, and you need to understand if that's going to give them any type of ownership to your formula. So that's an important thing to address. But I agree 100%, Jeremy, with cost. You know, my first manufacturer was very expensive, and they were as far away. They were out in the Pacific Northwest, in the far corner of Oregon. So you can imagine my shipping costs to get my product around the country. Everything was really expensive. My margin was really low, but they made a great product. They did, they drop shipped for me. They sourced ingredients for me. And those things saved me time and money and allowed me to focus on growing my company. And so there are those give and takes, and obviously it's going to be different for every company, but I think that's great advice. Mary or Vince, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I would chime in and say a lot of the things that Jeremy said are very important, perhaps even non-negotiable. I do think that to take a step back, for many of you who are entering into your first contract manufacturer search, it's important to think about your contract manufacturer as you would enter into a relationship, with a partner or with an investor. To a marriage. And you have to kind of wrestle with what is essential and non-negotiable, and what's the equivalent of stacking the dishwasher wrong or leaving too many socks on the floor. There are a lot of things that what Jeremy has outlined is sort of like the ideal case of what you would want to have in your contract with your manufacturer. But it would be the equivalent of going into a relationship with, a full 60-page prenup if you didn't have anything to offer. It's one thing if you already have a brand that's blowing up and you have POs in hand from Kroger and from Costco. It's another thing where you're just getting started, because to put yourself in the contract manufacturer's shoes, most contract manufacturers are not making any money at all on startup brands, oftentimes for the first year or two. And so what they're really betting on is that you're going to be a good growth partner for them for the future. So if you come in right off the bat making too many demands, they may you either shut the door on you nicely or rudely. And so you need to kind of approach it from that standpoint of you're selling your vision in, and you're selling in also your flexibility and willingness to accommodate the contract manufacturer. So in some cases, you might have the idea of going out the door with 12 different SKUs, but in reality, for them to be pragmatic, they can only do 3 SKUs for you, and you need to be able to flex on those kinds of issues. So I think, oftentimes if you are struggling with this, you want to make sure that you have somebody like a Jeremy or like a Veronica on your side to help you navigate through some of these issues. But it is important to recognize that in your first relationship, you want to approach it in a way with an attitude of what's in it for them.
Just a couple other quick follow-ups to those things. Veronica, you mentioned IP. Your contract manufacturer, like anyone who touches your formulation, R&D house, consultants, doesn't matter. Absolutely everybody should agree that all of the IP that's generated is yours and exclusively yours. Where it gets tricky is where a brand decides to do something that is not a knockoff product, but imagine you go to someone to make a bar and the co-man has all the information about the bar, and you basically go with their direction and say, okay, we'll make the bar this way. The co-man's a little bit nervous to say, well, then this IP is yours, because actually most of the idea and the development is there. So you do have to spend some time identifying kind of background intellectual property and foreground intellectual property, kind of who owns what pieces of the puzzle, but absolutely that should be in there. The second is Veronica said something that's really important to hear that relates to exclusivity. So one of the brands that I worked with that we ultimately sold to Coca-Cola, one of their best moments to create more profitability in the business was when they opened up their second co-man, and it allowed them to make sure that they were never shipping anything more than kind of 1,000 miles, right? So they had one on each coast. If you've agreed with someone that they're your exclusive provider, you are now shipping to all points from that one origin point. And that's a long-term problem. And so think carefully about those issues. And the thing that ties those two things together is another issue we've seen a lot of, which is, can you get a co-man to agree not to compete with you or not to create other kinds of products? For a brand that's an innovation brand, you often can get them to agree to certain kinds of non-competition and non-disintermediation. It's very difficult if you're a white label product or something like that. They're not going to agree not to make those products for other people they already make it for, right? If they make burgers for 17 different customers, they're not going to agree just because they're making burgers for you that they're not going to, make burgers for other people. So you do have to be thoughtful about this stuff. But for what it's worth, when you go to talk to angel or venture investors or private equity investors or acquirers, these issues are front and center in the diligence stack. Do you own your IP? What is your manufacturing situation? Who, is the acquirer or the investor going to inherit this thing? Is it reliable? All of these things come to the foreground in those moments.
Yeah. And I'd like to go back to Vince, you opened the door. I love your metaphor of relationships, right? So how I would open it with is, don't go to a third-party manufacturer knowing, oh, you know what, they're not really very good, I'll fix them, right? How many times have you said that about a partner? I can fix them. No, that's not the right way to start it, right? In fact, and I know we've talked a lot about, well, I'm a small guy and maybe they won't want my business, but I think you want to go in very positive. You've got great products, you've got great ideas. And let me tell you, all these big brands, what do they want? They want the next best thing. And that's worth a lot. There's a lot of value there. So if you can bring something like that to the table as well, and then that allows you guys to raise the bar, right? Because you don't want to, if you can help it, you don't want to put your business at risk. If you've got great products, shoot higher bar. In fact, one of the things, along the way, a really quick check on, gosh, does this third party really know what they're doing? Is the simple ask, if they would share, is, if they deal with the Kerrys, the McDonald's, the big brands out there, I will tell you that the chances of them meeting all the standards is there, right? So you've got already your work done for you. You know that reputationally they're going to be there to protect you in most cases. So there are other ways to get to understanding a third party by some basic, simple questions. But if you want to catch somebody's attention, third party or relationship, right? What do you bring to the table? And how can you help build that partnership? But don't ever put yourself second, right? You've got a lot to offer.
Mary, is it okay if I slightly disagree with you about one thing? Because no panel discussion should have everybody in agreement. Otherwise, everyone nods off to sleep. The one thing I'll say is that when a small brand is working at a co-man that is used to working with those big partners, there's no doubt that that provides some validation about quality and execution, and that's great. The downside is two things. Number one is they're used to working with big brands. So they're not used to working with a brand that doesn't have a full quality assurance team or an ops team. They're not used to working with a brand who things might show up late or payments might be late, or they're kind of oriented towards those bigger companies, and that can often make a difficult relationship. So try and work with folks who have experience working with small brands. And number two, I will say COVID was a great example, is that when things go wrong, they will 100% of the time prioritize their most important customers. And you will be at the very dead bottom of that list if you are doing only, $1 million or $2 million and they're a $1 billion outfit. So you really got to think about how do you become an important customer to them, and make sure that you are, if you see trouble ahead, that you're getting their attention through that process, not just at the inception moment.
Yeah, the only caveat, the only adjustment I would make to that, Jeremy, is if you've got really something special, it's not going to be that volume or the amount. It's going to be, that's a product that is, we can't not have. So yeah, I think there's truth to what you're saying for sure, but just making sure that your product is differentiating is probably really important as well.
Yeah, and you can bring the numbers to prove it, to show the growth that you're experiencing is important. So Mary, I know you touched on this earlier. Now that maybe you've narrowed down your commands and you're working with one, what are kind of the bare, I guess, I don't know if I want to say bare minimums, but when you're talking about quality assurance and you're a small brand and you want to make sure that you're checking all the necessary boxes, like what do you for sure need to have in place with your co-man? If you're early stage enough where you might not need all of those expensive certifications yet, it's an important thing to consider for the future. But talk to us about making sure you're going to get quality products. They're doing the polls, they're doing the testing. What's the kind of the baseline that you need to have at a manufacturer for that?
Yeah. Well, you really, the bare minimum is you have to meet, whether, depending on the product, whether it's USDA, FDA, FSMA requirements are, the law. So there's no getting around that. Also, if it's a kitchen, local health departments, things like that. And doing that, I think people think that quality is expensive. That's probably the biggest myth out there, right? Quality is not expensive. Quality actually allows you to be very direct, very efficient, optimize your growth, optimize your ability to ladder up to other, larger size corporations. So I would say and I kind of alluded to it earlier, right sizing your quality assurance to your target customer base is really important. So, for example, if you're going to deal with a Kerry, you're going to need all the levels. But if you're going to work with, I think Veronica, you've got a lot of experience, like some of the startup companies, you can get away with the bare minimums. And I would definitely just focus heavily on working with a consult. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah, your retailer, thinking about your retail plan, so where you are right now versus where you want to be, where, what retailers are you going to go to next and next and next, and what are their requirements for manufacturing and the certification and the quality assurance. Those are important things to consider too. Vince, what do you have to say on this quality assurance issue?
Yeah, I think that, Mary has outlined some of the key things that are required. Again, I think that it's something that, you need to kind of assess as far as what your product is. In some cases, it is relatively simple to determine safety, like in a high acid beverage situation. That is something where it requires less from a technology standpoint to ensure that it is food safe versus something that requires, say, retort or is on that has a cold chain product if you're dealing with USDA products. So all of those things are dependent on what your product is, and that should determine how much work you need to do to validate those that it meets those criteria.
Yeah, and definitely, I think your manufacturer should be able to very quickly produce their quality food safety documents for you to look through, and that should probably be one of the first questions that you ask when you're starting to consider a co-man. Along that same line, thinking about like the documents and the agreements and the contracts you need to have in place with a manufacturer. Jeremy, can you kind of speak to, again, like what are the first steps? What are the things you need to make sure you have in place when you're working with a co-man?
Yeah, and you have to be realistic, and I think Vince, you and Mary both touched on this. But when you're a tiny little brand and you approach a co-man and they hand you a 2-page co-man agreement, that may be what you end up having to sign, right? Like you might not have any leverage, you might not have a lot of choices about who can make your product, and sometimes you got to do what you got to do. So there's the difference between the ideal world and the actual world, and actually you often will sign something short and dirty and not in your favor, almost inevitably not in your favor. If you looked at the ideal world, a co-man agreement for a brand that's doing, let's say, north of $5 million or $10 million in product, that document's about a 30-page document, not including the specification document. It's long and it's complex and it's very detailed, and it's very detailed mostly for your benefit. Again, the co-man would rather say like, yep, we'll deliver X cases of Y product at $12.29 a case, love, hugs, and kisses us, right? That they'd be fine with that contract most of the time. There are other co-mans.
I signed a few of those, I think.
I think a lot of our audience members are probably not in that 5 million plus and are probably in the couple 100,000 range in terms of their sales today. What would you recommend as a good starting point from a legal document at that level?
Yeah, so at that point you kind of have to pick your poison, and probably what it's going to be around again is what's the exclusivity, what's the term of that deal, what's the pricing methodology of that deal. Trying to get some kind of reps around certification and condition of the plant and safety, but you're not going to probably get very much out of them. They're gonna have one line that's gonna say things like, "We manufacture all goods in accordance with applicable law," period, right? That's all it's gonna probably say. But to give you a sense of it, in a more complex document, you might have a specification document that gets attached to it that's 5, 10, 20 pages long. If you looked at a spec doc for Cheerios, I guarantee you that thing's a binder, not a cookbook recipe, right? And it describes every conceivable step of every part of the process from raw material forward. And you're not going to have that. Your formulation is often, blueberry bar with chocolate chips, right? That's, this weight, right? Like that's what early stage company specs look like.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have safety.
Maybe.
Was that?
And a picture maybe.
Right. As you get more mature and you start to think these things through, you realize that you want to have things like gold star samples, or you want to have sensory characteristics that you articulate. You want to have a ability to say, well, hey, this thing came off the line, and even though it meets the spec, it's blueberry with chocolate chips, it smells like carrots, right? Like something's wrong in this story. And so you have to go from kind of simple, because you can't afford legal help, you can't afford consulting help, and you can't afford a co-man at the high stage. So you're really focused on IP ownership, exclusivity, whether or not, again, that they're, how the pricing works, is it fixed or variable, and what you can expect. So you've got some predictability around your business. And sometimes that's all you get. And that document might be 2-3 pages. And that's what you have to prioritize. And it's imperfect, but as long as you don't give up one of those key things, like, oh, you own the IP only until I buy, X million from you, or which we see a lot in some of those early co-man deals, or things like, well, if you grow, we're your co-man for life, right? Like, don't do that. And pretty much everything else is fixable by being able to change the co-man at some later point if you need to.
So I know we're about 15 minutes out. I want to make sure that we've gotten to all of the questions in the chat. I know I've seen some of the panelists monitoring and answering. Adrian, are there questions that we need to address, or maybe the audience wants to ask some questions before we sign off on specific topics?
Yes, we do. I'm going to first call on Louis Goldstein. Louis, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question to the group.
How's it going? Thanks for the panel doing this. And my question is, we are a crisp bread and cracker manufacturer that self-manufactures in Maine now. In early first quarter of 26, our current estimates, which I know will be wrong, but our current estimates have us outgrowing our manufacturing facility in its current state. Current state meaning without huge amounts of equipment expenditures, without adjusting the size of the building. And I'm trying to answer potential investors' questions and also understand on my own, what process do we go through to try to determine, does co-man come into play to be a part of our mix along with our self-manufacturing? Is it much more pragmatic to just look into expanding our manufacturing so that we continue to do it on our own? I have no experience in co-manufacturing, so it scares me, the whole thought of the co-man. So trying to understand, what is the process for determining, does co-man become part of our future, or does our own operation expanding be where we focus on? Is it just a financial decision, and who helps us figure the thing out? And what's the timing of trying to do it, assuming that either a big investment or a co-man has to happen in the first half of 26?
So I'm happy to give you the perspective of the investors, at least, from, and that perspective has shifted over the last 5 years pretty dramatically. 5 years ago, investors wanted asset-light companies who were laser focused on sales and marketing and growth. And they wanted to let brands have co-mans who were experts at manufacturing be the manufacturing party. COVID hit, supply chain disruption hit, renewed focus on profitability hit, and all of a sudden investors are now interested, at least, in, can you self-manufacture so you can control your cost structure? Can you manufacture so you can control your predictability in your supply chains? And so there's real arguments about why self-manufacturing is good. The reality is that most brands start off in a kitchen, they end up in a co-man, and 8-10 years later, they start thinking about bringing the manufacturing back in-house where they can control all those issues and get the cost savings. But there's no right answer. The right answer is, like, what are you best at? Where is your capital best deployed? And what's going to enable you to hit your growth targets? And sometimes that means co-man, and sometimes that means the opposite of co-man. There are products out there that cannot be done. If you're a low aseptic beverage, you can't manufacture it yourself unless, $10 million fell out of the sky and hit you on the head. Wow. And even then, those facilities are what, $100 million at the small end. So, it's just a non-starter in the cracker and snack business that you're in, Louis. There are good people out there who can support. And sometimes what folks will do is they'll split the difference. They'll say, I'm going to put this line through co-man because I can trust it more. and there's some efficiencies, and I'm going to maintain this line over here in-house because there's, you know, reason XYZ why we need to have it in-house and have control in that way. But I don't know, Vince, you think about this stuff in both your hats, so maybe you're better positioned.
Yeah, I think that, you know, Lewis, given that you already have a facility, that's a good place to start, but it doesn't hurt to have conversations with outside co-mans just so that you can start to understand what their capabilities would look like and at what price. And then you can make a more educated decision. While I do agree with Jeremy that there has been a little bit more interest in vertically integrated companies that have their own manufacturing capabilities, the reality is that most innovation, 90% plus of innovation that happens out there is still done with co-manufacturers. And if you look at the biggest companies out there like General Mills and Kraft Heinz, they use networks of over 400 contract manufacturers each. If you look at the financial reporting of Kraft last year, they shed 10 of their own facilities and moved all that production to contract manufacturing. So contract manufacturing plays a very important role in the ecosystem, whether you're, you know, tiny or you're massive. And at the massive scale, it is more about making sure that your facilities are focused on the things that you want to have the most control over, and then you know, outsourcing to a more efficient structure for those products that maybe aren't, you know, your Cheerios or your biggest products.
Yeah, and Lewis, I would say, you know, first of all, congratulations. That's a great problem to have. So good job. And always go with your gut. I'm sure your gut has taken you there. My experience, if I can control it within my own facility, that would be my first choice. But I think Vince and Jeremy bring up excellent points. And if it's, you know, it's simply too expensive or you want to avoid that capital expense, I would say keep your bar higher and try to source third-party manufacturers that do business with the larger companies. Yes, there are potentially downsides to whether they think you're important enough for them, but their culture is going to drive performance that perhaps you wouldn't have the same problems or have to invest your own team's time and energy on the basics of running that business.
Okay, thank you.
I'll add one more thing, which is, you know, think about, do you want to be the manager of a bunch of line personnel, right? Because it's a whole different business than the business most of you are in, of having, you know, 3 shifts of often not very skilled workers, some of whom speak English, some of whom may not. And those people rotate out and they have employment issues and physical safety issues. And there's a lot to running those kinds of organizations. And a lot of people who are in the brand business are not excited to get into that kind of business. I'll offer one other thing, which is when we talk about going to a co-man, if you are not going to a co-man that is a full wrap, then it's really a mix anyway, right? And a classic example of that is entrepreneurs who have family roots, usually ex-US, and they use that network to source some ingredient, whatever, from India, from Malaysia, it doesn't matter from where. And they have a network. They're not going to turn over that sourcing relationship to a co-man, right? They're going to manage that thing because it's their relationship. And so that key ingredient may be inside the brand, even though you're co-manning. And that may be true of everything, particularly in beverage. Oftentimes the co-man is only putting the liquid in the package, sterilizing and sealing, right? Everything that goes into the liquid happens not at the co-man sometimes. Sometimes there's a separate blending facility, sometimes not, right? And so it's not a they own it or you own it. It's a you own it collectively and you have to figure out which pieces of it, to Mary's point, that you need to control in order to maintain quality and cost.
Thank you all for that feedback.
Great discussion.
Yes.
What
definitely.
other questions do we have?
I would like to call on Nate Summer next to unmute himself and ask a question.
Hey guys, so I work for a brand, and so it's kind of what we just were talking about. We ended up, after 9 years, acquiring one of our co-mans to bring manufacturing in-house. And so my question is specifically regarding around like contracts from the co-man side. So co-man we've been working with for a while. We really, we wouldn't have gone through the acquisition if we didn't love their quality and safety and service. Financial acumen, not so great. Part of also why the opportunity was so good. And so on contracts, this is a smaller organization, been around for 50 years, lots of handshake deals, lots of emails, and not a lot of contracts. Also, a lot of turnkey product, not so much tolling. So I feel like we're in a pretty vulnerable spot right now, like sourcing and procurement. We're working off of forecasts from customers that maybe are right, maybe aren't, but we're buying all the product, and so it's really on us. And so I'm interested in thoughts and advice on one, how enforceable are things like email descriptions and agreements via email and stuff like that. And then also, some of these customers, we've got customers that are maybe we'll do one run for a few days once a year for them, but we also have customers that are Fortune 500 companies that we're working, we're running product every day for. So introducing more formal contracts or more formal agreements to customers that have been around for decades and haven't had to deal with that. Looking for advice on that front as well.
Yeah, I can chime in there. So one of my other hats that I wear is a partner at a private equity firm that acquires contract manufacturers. So we've had a fair amount of experience with this. And one of the things that you will want to do is put in place, actual contracts to replace those provisional agreements. Most brands will go along with that. Again, there's a question of how much you can put into, like how much effort you want to expend in doing that, because many of the brands will, just look to go elsewhere. A lot of times you may also want to look at consolidating your customers and identifying which customers are actually, profitable for you or that you want to maintain relationships with. We see a lot of manufacturers that undergo sort of like a paring down of relationships of customers that may only do one run a year, and that's really a question of what your values are and what what kinds of relationships you want to have with your customers. But definitely you want to get those contracts in, but it's also not unusual at all. You're kind of entering into a situation that I would say is probably the majority of contract manufacturers that are doing less than, say, 10 million in revenue.
You asked a more technical question as well, as are those enforceable? And that, as it turns out, is a really complicated question. It depends whether the contract is for the sale of goods and is subject to the statute of frauds, or is a contract for services and may not be. But generally speaking, an email constitutes a writing. And so they do have to be written contracts, but a written contract can be a cocktail napkin. It can be an email. It doesn't have to be what looks like a formal legal document. The law doesn't make provision for those things. It does say, it has to have the material terms where somebody can find them. So a slew of emails is a contract, but it may be a contract that doesn't address 57 of the 62 issues that you would have wished to address. So I agree with everything that Vince said. From a cash flow standpoint, it's not crazy if you're a small contract manufacturer that you either don't front ingredient costs or you ask for things like letters of credit. There's an old saying that like contracts exist because people can't or won't perform their side of the deal, right? So if they just choose not to, then could you go sue a brand for performance? Sure. But if the brand is broke, it doesn't matter that you sue them, right? They're broke. You can't get blood out of a stone. And so credit risk and insolvency are real issues. And COVID was a great example of that. There were plenty of payers who went out of business, so it didn't matter that you had a contract; they couldn't pay. So if you're willing to take on that risk, that's a business decision. But there are co-mans who say like, we're out of the risk business, and so you either prepay us. I mean, post-COVID, we saw a lot of co-mans went to at least 50% prepay for smaller brands. Sometimes that was the prepay. Sometimes it was the whole amount. Sometimes it was the ingredient cost. Sometimes it was the ingredient cost plus 50% of the service fee. We saw a lot of folks move to a more risk-averse model. So that's not a crazy thing.
Cool, thank you.
If it's okay with our panelists, we do have a couple more questions. The first one was from Nick. Can you go deeper at what scale it makes sense to start transitioning from a co-packer to your manufacturing facility? Your own manufacturing.
What was the?
Like
I mean,
what is the scale, right? What is the scale at which you bring things back in-house? I don't know that from my perspective, there's any particular number or any particular thing. It's,
No.
you know, what is the moment at which you're either trying to recover the lost margin and you can afford the capital infrastructure, or there's some kind of quality issue or control issue that you're just frustrated with and you can't get reliable performance out of a partner for some reason. But I don't know that that's a real specific answer.
Yeah, I think it's a complex combination of what your financial needs are and what your operational and control needs are. There are some very large companies that do this, and actually, it's a very bad decision. I can think of one very large hard seltzer brand that you have probably seen and maybe even consumed. They thought they were going to continue to grow like this as in the summer of 2021. And what do you know? Hard seltzers started to taper off, and they had just built 3 gigantic facilities around the country. And then they had to scramble to try to, become a contract manufacturer themselves to fill that capacity because, it turns out that they didn't, continue to 2 or 3x every year.
Great. And the last one from Justin was, does anyone know or recommend a place to find an operations or a plant manager that can get our facility to GSFI?
Oh, JPG does that. We do offer, we consult, but we do offer fractional support, and we have a practice area called talent where you can actually, we source people throughout the industry and you can hire them full-time, part-time through our talent to place, to place them for as long as you need them, long and short as you need them.
Well, we are at time. I want to just thank everyone again for joining us today, our incredible panelists. This was extremely insightful, and we will look forward to seeing you all again very soon.